na još jedno druženje sa našim Johnom Freemanom, koji na početku smo ga najavljivali kao gosta domaćina, ali mislim da definitivno sada postaje domaćin i u Sarajevu i domaćin Bookstana. Današnji program trećeg festivalskog dana počeli smo sa Johnovom radionicom namijenjenoj mladim studentima i studenticama koji iz cijele Bosne i Hercegovine, njih skoro 30, svaki dan vrijedno rade u okviru Bookstana i kako su mi prenijeli, bilo je inspirativno, naučili su mnogo. John im je govorio o različitim načinima pristupa tekstu od strane više autora, kao primjer je uzeo s razlogom 4 kritike knjige Aleksandra Hemona, koji je također i danas s nama i koji je definitivno domaćin prvog festivalskog izdanja Bookstana, koji je osmislio slogan No East, No West i u koji se savršeno svojim autorstvom i pristupom i životu i radu uklapa Kamila Shamsie, koja nam je juče, ako se ne varam, stigla i pretpostavljam da će podijeliti s nama jednako ugodne trenutke kakve smo imali svi mi u prethodna 2 dana. Centralna tema današnjeg razgovora bit će Freemanov časopis polugodišnjeg karaktera. John Freeman, ako je neko propustio jedno od njegovih moderiranja i nastupa u okviru Bookstana, je jedan od vodećih kritičara, američkih autor koji ima niz naslova prevedenih na više od 20 jezika, bio je predsjednik Asocijacije nacionalne kritičara i, kako to kaže Aleksandar Hemon, sigurno najbolji poznavatelj savremene književnosti napisane na engleskom jeziku. Prepuštam.
Every time I get on an airplane, I hope to get upgraded. And how I understand how to get upgraded is just to keep talking, and maybe I can be a guest host on British Airways on my flight home. It's a big pleasure to be here presenting an issue of Freeman's. This issue in front of you is the first issue, which is themed to arrival, and I thought I would talk for about 2 minutes just about why I put together a collection of new writing by authors I admire. In general, I think we live in a culture starved of context. I think we often silo people within certain categories. And in general, I think writing moves better and means more when it's set up against the world and set up against other writing. And it's a very old piece of technology, but it's a long-standing and very effective one. A literary journal or anthology, which is what this is, I think can transport us to places that are 20 times as interesting as one book, if it's well presented and the authors in it are of high quality, which I am lucky to say that the first issue has 2 of my favorite writers. They're on stage with me now to my right, which is Kamila Shamsie. You will be hearing her tomorrow talking about her most recent novel, A God in Every Stone. It is her 6th work of fiction, and she is, I think, one of the most epic and illuminating storytellers alive today, because she sees through the lives of characters who live and breathe and love and die, the forces of history changing people's lives, sometimes without them knowing it, directing their lives and making choices for them. And on my left, this guy that keeps appearing on stage, his name is Aleksandar. You can call him Sasha. He's also the work of nearly half a dozen works of fiction. Tonight he'll be presenting a new work of his columns, his 3rd book of columns, but he wrote a piece for the Freeman's issue as well. So I thought I would start out just at the very outset, which is I commissioned this anthology with the idea that of 2 things: that most literary journals are far too much about writing and not enough about living. And also that most literary journals, unfortunately, have a nationalistic flavor, which is that they put writers together from the same places. And I thought I would start with the first issue theme being arrival, because unless one of you is the immaculate Son of God, we all arrive in the world in the same way. We're all born, we arrive, we know nothing. Our minds are programmed, if you believe Steven Pinker, for language, and that's it. And then we start. But obviously from there things diverge quite rapidly. And so I thought I would ask Kamila, in the context of your own life, what have been some significant arrival points? And how do you experience them as a person and as a writer? And how do they prepare you to write or make you want to write?
Well, you know, when you asked me to write a piece for Freeman, and all John said was, the theme is arrival, do anything. And I said, well, I'm going to Antarctica next month, which I really was. So I'm sure there'll be a story to tell there. And about a couple of months later, when he emailed me again and said, have you got something for me? And of course, I hadn't written a word. But I realized that the arrival I wanted to write about, the story of arrival, wasn't about going to Antarctica, a continent I didn't know, had no historical context for, and where I knew no one. That actually the story of arrival I wanted to tell was about going to a part of Pakistan, which is one of my homes. It's a country in which I grew up. I want to write about going to a part of it that I'd never been to before. And though, you know, arriving somewhere without context, it sort of became interesting then to think of the difference between Antarctica, which really did feel as close to a blank white page as any nation could be, partly because it's not a nation. That the interesting arrivals are always arrivals in some place where there is an aspect of familiarity and context. And you are moving between ignorance and knowing, which is what that story became about. And so the point of, you know, arrivals that are significant in my life, I wouldn't so much say the day I arrived in America as a student for a first time, although in a sort of chronological way, I suppose, that would be the first time I left home, left Karachi and went to live somewhere else. But I would say reading Midnight Children was an important moment of arrival for me as a writer. And finding myself in bits of Karachi and realizing this is the city I live in, but I'm a stranger in these parts, that's another kind of arrival. So it is always about the sort of ignorance where you expect to find familiarity, and sometimes familiarity where you expect to find ignorance. So going to India for the first time was an incredibly important moment as well, because here was this country next door, where because it had been partitioned from Pakistan in 1947, my family was originally from there, half my family was still there. We have all these cultural connections, but we're also national enemies. And so again, that movement between enmity and intimacy, between foreignness and familiarity, was a really important way of thinking about the place I come from.
What about you, Sasha? Obviously, arriving in the U.S. in 1992 is one arrival, but can you work a little bit backwards from that and think of other ones that somehow marked your life, that changed the way that you narrativized yourself and your sense of reality?
Well, there's the arrival of my family on my father's side to Bosnia. As many of you, all of you should know, and many of you do know, that Bosnia was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire after 1878 Berlin Congress until 1914, when the Archduke was shot down the street. But during that time, the empire was colonizing Bosnia, importing people from the other parts of the empire, which included people from what is now Western Ukraine, but back in the day it was called Galicia, or Galicia in English, and then Bukovina. So my father's side, the family packed up their meager belongings in 1912, that is, my grandfather's family. And they made their way to Bosnia, where they got a piece of land and on which my father was born. And so they brought with them bees and beehives, and particular Western Ukrainian dialect, and a kind of vague notion of Ukrainian identity, national identity. They were actually, when they arrived in Bosnia, they were called Galicians, Galiciani. And they lived in part of Bosnia around Penjavor, northwest Bosnia, where there were, before World War II, there were, I think, 20 different nationalities. And after World War II, after Germans and some others left, there were, I think, about 50. There's an Italian village, Stivor, a couple of miles away from Penjavor. In 1992, the Italian government sent a bus or two to transfer some people, to send them back to their homeland. Of course, they hadn't seen this in 2 or 3 generations. They were people who descended from northern Italy, from Tiro, which was part of the empire too. And they spoke Italian. That dialect had been in that village, and they wore the Tyrolean Italian National Guard. In any case, my family arrived in Bosnia in 1912. My grandmother's family arrived before that, but I don't know the years, we don't know the years. And so, to this day, my father's side of the family, people speak Ukrainian, in particular Western Ukrainian dialect that has been contaminated by Bosnian words and other words. And so my father sings in Ukrainian choir. They live in Canada, in Ukrainian choir, and sings Ukrainian songs and all this. And so this arrival is obviously very important. I would not be a Bosnian without an arrival. But it's also the fact of the matter is that nobody from that side of the family died in the country where they were born. My grandfather didn't die in the country where he was born. My father will not die probably, unless he dies when he was in Sarajevo or Bosnia. And I don't plan to die anytime soon, so I'm deferring that particular arrival for as long as possible. But there's this, inscribed in family history is this cycle of arrivals, or cycles of arrivals. On the mother's side, we've always lived here. No one remembers a time when they were not in Bosnia. We were not in Bosnia. On this side of the Freeman living.
Kamila, in Sasha's work is often blending the stories of his family's arrival and their migrations into sort of fictionalized or mythologized migrations of characters who are like him but significantly different in key ways. Have you braided into your own work the stories that your family tells about its own arrivals or departures, if you will, to and from Pakistan?
In different ways. There's my second novel, Salt and Saffron, has a family in Karachi. Half the family is in India, so it is very much a divided family, which was the story of my grandparents, because both my grandparents at partition in 1947 came across the new border from India to Pakistan, but many of their siblings stayed behind them. My grandmother died in 2004, and every Thursday between 1947 and 2004, she would write a letter to her sister in India, in Rampur, and the sister would write back. And so they maintained these very close connections through that time. So Salt and Saffron has a more obvious kind of, because it's more obviously about a divided family. But actually, I think the figure in all my work who most closely takes the stories of both my grandmothers is actually a story of a Japanese woman in Bird Shadows. Because one of my grandmothers, as I said, was born in India, then moved to Pakistan. The other one is German. She was born in Berlin, then in the 30s moved to India, and then at partition in 1947 moved to Pakistan and lived there till she died in 1999. And they were completely different women, my two grandmothers, but the thing that at a certain point I realized they had in common was both of them had faced this sort of forced migrations in a way. They didn't choose to, the German grandmother, fell in love with an Indian man and sort of eloped with him in the 20s, can you imagine doing this? And then, married 3 Muslim men as if to make up for the horrors of what her nation was doing to people who not themselves. But both the grandmothers had in common the fact that I didn't see them lament or weep for this past. They both, despite the connections that certainly my maternal grandmother kept up, they both had a really sort of forward-facing attitude. And if I ever tried to talk and say, do you wish it had been different, or particularly my maternal grandmother who I knew better, she'd sort of say, this is my life. And that was very much her attitude, was this is my life, I have to live it. And so I ended up writing about a Japanese woman who survives the bombing of Nagasaki and loses her entire city really and her family, and then sort of has to go and make homeland elsewhere. And that's very much in there. But the other part that I wanted to in some way work into it, because the German character has many languages. But there's a point, I mean, she speaks many languages, but there's a point when she's surrounded by people, none of whom speak Japanese, and she's thinking about a lost language. And in some way that was, I think, the story of my German grandmother, who in 1939 suddenly found she was living in British India. Her husband, my grandfather, had a very high up position in the railways, which of course was a very logistically, strategically important kind of thing. And so she was under constant suspicion of being a German spy. And there's a story of how she said every day there'd be tales that, someone had seen Mrs. Shamsie speaking to some German man somewhere. And one day she went to the police station and she walked in and she said to the chief of police, I'm going to sit here all day. And he said, for heaven's sake, why? And she said, I'm just going to sit here all day. Is there a cell or somewhere? And he said, no, I'm putting in a cell, you can sit in my office. And she spent the whole day there. And the next day there were rumors, yesterday Mrs. Shamsie was seen speaking to so-and-so, and the police chief said, no, actually the only person she spoke to was me. But what she did at this point was to stop speaking German, because she decided that was drawing attention to her Germanness, and she banned all her children from speaking German. And suddenly, overnight, this family that had been completely trilingual, it just cut off one language. And as a writer, of course, to think about cutting off a language, and Sasha, of course, you know about being in a place with another language and having to make it. But I wanted to pay homage, I think, to that story of my grandmother via the tale of a Japanese woman in Delhi in 1947.
Sasha, do you remember the moment that you'd arrived in America, you figured out you were stuck behind, you began to dedicate yourself to learning English as a literary language, although you already spoke some of it and knew it, had read in English. But do you remember the moment that more of your thoughts were shifting from Bosnian into English? As in you were not translating objects and thoughts and sentences? Or are they still to you mixed in your head, as in you switch between?
I remember the moment when, well, it's not exact moment, I remember the time, when I would dream in English, and in my dream I would notice that people in my dream were speaking English, and in my dream I would find that strange. And then, even more strangely, I would remember in English things that would not have taken place in English at all. Conversations with my friend Veo, for instance, and even Sarajevo, things that happened in Bosnia for sure. And the way I understood it then, I understand it now in fact, too, is that there was a period of time, about 3 years, when my subconscious mind was absorbing English language. Obviously, your native language, one's native language, is part of your subconscious mind, always, because you absorb it without learning it, so to speak, as a child. But because I had learned English as a second language, it was external to my being and practices in Sarajevo, or even early in my time in the United States. It was, well, outside of me. And for me to be able to write, it was necessary. I did not will it, but it was necessary to understand that the language entered my subconscious mind, because it is from this place that the writing language as well as speaking language is coming. In other words, if it's there, you don't have to think about it. It's not you don't have to make conscious choices. It's like walking, right? I don't have to make a decision to put my left foot first, and then my right foot, and then my left foot. It just happens. And so that happened, this absorption of the English language into my subconscious mind, would happen roughly in the time that coincides with the war in Bosnia. And I'm convinced that it was possible because to some extent I had lost my mind. That there was some kind of defensive mechanism that a mind that is not traumatized or distraught puts up, to protect this subconscious mind and the language that is comfortable in it, or languages for that matter. That I'm not sure that my acquisition of the English language, the writing language, would have been possible if I actually was not losing my mind to some extent. I've been trying to learn French for many years, and I cannot put a sentence in French together after all this time because I have not lost my mind yet. I look forward to the moment where I lose my mind again and start speaking French. But I don't remember sorting out my thoughts in that way. Just there was a bottom of the bottom of my mind fell out, and then suddenly the English language was inside. Not quite suddenly, but it entered it, and then it's there still.
Kamila, obviously, some arrivals are more notable than others. There's a difference between a visitor and a traveler. Women generally have less agency as travelers than men. The lighter your skin, the easier it is. The color of your passport, the circumstances of your class, all these things factor into arrivals and your ability to arrive safely in places. On top of which, all arrivals are, at least in the world that we live in, are mediated. There's someone adjudicating your arrival. There's a border control person. And if not, there might be someone lurking in the background, as there sort of is in your piece, watching you. And so as an arrival, you're not just slightly estranged, but the place that you're arriving is estranged from you. I wonder, as a writer, as a woman, as a feminist, as a traveler, how you mediate all those differences, because I imagine, as a frequent traveler, these can pile up and make you quite angry.
Well, there's so much else in the world to be angry about than the circumstances of my particular travels. But it was interesting because I acquired a British passport in 2013. Prior to that, I had a Pakistani passport. And I feel sometimes, I don't know if fraudulent is the right word, treacherous, sometimes, because it's so easy to travel with a British passport. I mean, it's obscene, it's actually an obscenity. The difference between traveling on a Pakistani passport and traveling on a British passport. So when I had a Pakistani passport, and because I had there were all kinds of privileges I had going for me, which meant I did get to travel. And a lot of the travel was to festivals, which was fantastic because it meant there were always very nice festival people who would do all kinds of sponsorship work for you. So I never actually got rejected for a visa, although I often didn't apply because I would look at requirements and time and think no. And if you have a Pakistani passport, you're invited something, and the first thing you do is to not check if you need a visa, you check what kind of visa process you need. And so you go into the country's website, and they'll say, list of visa-free countries. You don't even look at that one. Then it's countries that need a visa, and then there's always an asterisk. And then you look down to where the asterisk is, because the asterisk will say, these are the rules for all the countries of the world except these countries. If you belong to one of the asterisk countries, then there's a whole separate procedure. And the asterisk countries are Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, Pakistan, Syria, about 5 others. Bosnia, not as much, I want to tell you, having seen them. Okay, we'll talk about it later. And so then, of course, you have to go through, it's sort of, for anyone else it takes 2 days for you. If you're lucky, 3 weeks or 6 weeks or 3 months, or so there were years when I'd have these calendars and work out. So at this point, I have to hand in my passport there. It'll be there for so long, so I can't go to this. I can't, all of that. And now that I've moved into this other world, the really annoying thing now is, not that it's annoying, there's a part of me that's completely gleeful, but you hold up your British passport, and half the time they don't even check your picture inside. So I could have been doing this all along with anyone with a passport. But there is, so funny enough, having the British passport and traveling with ease now makes me angry, and part of it is of course, that I'm allowing myself to be angry. So that if, as a Pakistani, you're then angry about these things, that won't do at all, because you're going to walk into visa offices angry, whereas actually you must walk in smiling, and all these things. And you learn this, this thing I used to learn where I would arrive in a country and I would make sure that I would meet the eye of the immigration officer and smile, so they could have some kind of idea of who they thought I was before I put forward the Pakistan passport. And you could see the shock, because of course there's a certain image in their mind of what a Pakistani looks like. So these sort of things you learn, these kind of behaviors. But I think not having anger about all that would be much more problematic than having anger.
Sasha, we were talking earlier, there's an event for Freeman's on Saturday in Berlin, and I've just gone through helping a writer from Jamaica get a visa to Berlin, which is not easy, and you began describing what it was like to travel with a green card, with a Sarajevo identity card. And it occurs to me that frequently in literary circles we have this discussion, it's like, why are all the writers from Britain in America? Those are the passports they hold, because it allows them greater freedom to travel the world and publish and exist in the world as quote-unquote transnational writers. But that's really just a reflection of the mechanics of travel and passport control rather than identity to some degree. Do you agree?
No, I agree. When I acquired my American passport in 2000, just between the election in 2000 and the Supreme Court decision that gave the election to Bush, my first sentiment as an American was an embarrassment. But before that, this was in the United States at the time, after 5 years of having a green card, and I had it, you could get a passport. So I applied for my passport 3 years after that, after I qualified for a passport. And I did that because I started publishing, and so I was invited to promote my book in Holland or France or the UK. I had to submit my bank statements, invitations, my recommendation letters, and all this. And they have a different air about themselves if you are submitting those things. And of course, I internalize this. And do I look suspicious? That's always concerned me. And of course, if you do not want to look suspicious, everyone makes you look suspicious. And I don't smile naturally, so if I smile, people say, he has something on his mind. But I remember the first time, because this Kamila was speaking, when I went with my American passport to the UK. In the UK, there were political assholes across the UK with a non-Western passport. And so I gave my American passport to this guy, and I wasn't expecting this because I thought I'm good now with an American passport. He'd asked me, so where are you staying? And your sister, and what does your sister do? And do you have a return ticket? And I had to dig through my stuff. The whole, looking suspicious fear kicked in. And I was dealing with this, flustered, when his supervisor, this guy's supervisor, came from behind, took my passport in his hand, looked at it, and said to him like this, no. He said, an American businessman, he said, American businessman on scale from 1 to 10 is 1.5 to 2, and gave me my passport back. What the scale was, I did not know to this day, but I was 1.5. One of the great accomplishments of my life. And I was 1.5 on that scale. And he said, have a welcome, sir. I just walked in. And the difference was I was occupying both positions at that moment. Both moment before I was an American, I was a Bosnian, and so it was the attitude shifted in the second.
Can I tell you my coming into Britain story? It'd been around 2002, 2003, so it was post 9/11, but it was still relatively recently post 9/11. And I was completely on a Pakistani passport. At that point, I wasn't even a resident in Britain. I just had a tourist visa, and I'd been in Germany and was flying to London. And I flew into Gatwick, and there was an immigration guy being trained. And I thought, this is the worst thing that could happen to me. Because there were two lines, there was the EU and non-EU. So everyone went into EU, and there were 3 of us in the non-EU line. There was a woman in front of me, a Chinese woman, there was me and someone behind. And the Chinese woman went ahead, and she was a student, and they were grilling her question after question after question, and document. And I thought, oh my God, I don't have anything, and this is going to be a complete disaster. And I went up, and the guy who's being trained, the younger man, looks at my passport. And then the older guy says, so, it's a Pakistani passport, but look at her. Look at the way she's dressed. I said, no Pakistani auntie has ever made me feel so conscious about how I dress. I was wearing jeans and a t-shirt. And not even a kind of cleavage t-shirt. It was just, look at the way she's dressed. And she's traveling unaccompanied, there's no male escort. This tells you, he said, that she's either been to university in America or England. I felt so annoyed that he was right that I had been to university in America, because that wasn't in fact the reason that my family has no issues with women traveling alone. And so, then he says to the younger guy, look through the passport for an American student visa. And he looked through and there was an old American student visa. And the guy said, okay, all you have to say is, how long are you staying? Have a nice time.
You know, these are all funny stories, but obviously we live in an era of intense and constant digital surveillance of virtually everything we write that is sent via the internet, is routed through polls in Florida and backlogged in Google and Facebook servers. And so in some ways our digital self is constantly arriving in new places, but that arrival is also constantly being watched. And on top of that, if you travel enough and you have certain stamps in your passport, or if you are a writer that makes statements about the equal value of human life or the value of women, anywhere will get you certain other friends to follow you around. And I wonder, Sasha, you were describing your experience of being observed. Can you describe that here? And have you ever had more intense one-on-one communication with someone that's...
Well, it's a long story. When I lived here in Sarajevo, I got in trouble in '87, so I was a little detained by state security with some of my friends, and then was followed and eavesdropped upon a little bit with many other people, but it was really not, I mean, it did not make me into a dissident, but I was just aware that there were people watching. I started identifying them. Of course, there's a terrible side to it. One is a friend or a self-evident enemy, but there are people that you can't quite read. At least I'm prone to a kind of arrogance I have arrogance thinking I can read people, I can tell whether they're assholes or not, but that's not how it works. And I remember after I had my state security trouble, going to a movie theater once, and I was talking to you about it today, and sitting next to a guy he was young and he went to all the clubs and places and say that I went to Cook and Cactus and whatever coffee shop. And he flashed his state security badge or identity card to me with the clear intention to show me that he was from state security. It was not a mistake, just so I know that I was being followed. I'm sorry, all that I was watching some stupid movie. What is he going to do to me? But the intention and all that guy, and also the NSA eavesdropping every single night and all the phone calls, is not to catch the culprit. It is to be aware, to make people aware that they're being watched, so that you discipline yourself, self-discipline. I remember when Ceausescu fell down in '89, we watched a live broadcast here. Yugoslav television picked up a live signal from the studio in Bucharest that was taken over by the revolutionaries, and they would broadcast, proclamations, and during live broadcasts you would hear the shooting of, the Securitate trying to get in and so on. So a lot of things about the Ceausescu regime came out at that time, and I remember that one of the things that came out was that Ceausescu issued a decree that all of the phones in the country had to be at some point replaced by the phones that were bugged in the factory. So you just turning the phone in, there was no secret about this. So everyone had to have a bugged phone. And I remember thinking then, but I mean, I think by the time Ceausescu fell, half of the phones were replaced roughly. I thought, so all right, even if all the phones were bugged, who has time to listen to all that crap? I mean, on the one hand, the Romanians probably wouldn't speak and say things that they thought at the time, but also who's going to process all that crap? But the point was, as is the point with all these people eavesdropping, that we know that they're eavesdropping on us. And this guy, he wasn't really a kid. He was younger than me at the time, at least my age, and I was in my 20s. He flashed this thing, not to scare me, but just to make me aware that they're watching me even when they're not watching me, so that I could internalize the discipline and self-control. So it didn't do much for him, I don't think.
Kamila, I was reading an intellectual biography of Jam Coetzee, and when he was writing his first book, Dusklands, I think, he was living in South Africa, and texts were, usually in most places, television is the most censored, followed by radio, followed by magazines, and books are quite far down because few people read them. And so, in some ways, Coetzee's first readers were his censors. And so he had a quite open and direct relationship with them. So he applied to have his book censored and explained which parts he would censor if he was censoring it himself. And I wonder if you could talk a bit about the last sort of recent history of publishing in Pakistan, and to what degree any literature ever has to be censored, and if it is, what tends to be censored.
What's happened now, some years ago I was talking to a group of writers from Singapore. I was interviewing them in London, and there was someone from the Singapore embassy sitting in the audience. So I was quite careful about not, asking questions that might get them into trouble, but also wanting to give them space. So if they wanted to make some kind of statement, they could. And I asked, whether there were things they felt they weren't allowed to write about. And let's say there were 4 writers, there were 4 or 5. So there were 4 writers, 3 of them said, we can write about anything we want. And then one of the women said, look, I write about homosexuality, I write about, relationships after marriage, I write and the other one said, and I've written about this, and I've written about that. And the 4th, who was the most thoughtful, he said, well, you see, it's very interesting now in Singapore, they don't have to censor any of us. Because we've grown up with such strong internal censors that there are certain topics our imagination simply will not allow us to go. So we don't know we're going there, we don't know we're moving away from them, we don't know we've been censored. That the state has done its work so thoroughly that it just doesn't happen. In Pakistan, I think there are various topics. There's always been a very strong tradition, particularly among poets and journalists, of speaking out in resistance to all kinds of things. And you would speak out against military governments, and you would do all of that. But there are 2 subjects, I think, that have made people in the last 5-10 years much more wary, where it's not that you're going to get thrown to prison, but you feel you could get killed, and not necessarily by the state, but in some cases by the state. And one of them is around religion, and the other one is around the state of Balochistan, which has been in a state of insurrection, and where there have been all kinds of horrific reprisals. So there's the state and their non-state actors both. And there was one of the few people who used to talk and write about what happened in Balochistan very bravely and freely, and used to terrify all of us, was the wonderful novelist Muhammad Hanif, who's also a fantastic journalist. And Hanif wrote these brilliant sort of series of essays on the disappeared in Balochistan, and he would come on TV and talk about it as well. And there was one day I was in Karachi, and I said, look, obviously on one hand, people need to be talking about it, and I'm incredibly proud you are, but on the other hand, you're my friend, and I don't want you to be dead. And he said, well, you don't need to worry about that anymore, because I'm not doing it anymore. And I said, really? He said, well, the reason I'm not doing it anymore is no one will ask me on TV anymore to talk about it. And that it was TV that was the real issue, because the English language media, although he also writes in Urdu, has a smaller circulation. But to get on TV, on Urdu language television, to talk about these issues, he said, they just won't ask me. And there were a couple of newspaper anchors, of TV anchors who talked about them, one of whom is I know, and they both had assassination attempts. And so there are, it's now become the one thing of the state. So everyone can say anything they want for the civilian government, and they do all the time. But, the worst kind of crimes that have been committed are where there is the deeper silence, and where people literally are getting killed around it. It is one of the most dangerous countries for journalists, and it's actually journalists more than, if you're an English language novelist, you're so far down anyone's range of interest. But if you're a journalist working in Urdu, the other vernacular languages, Pakistan is, I think, the second most dangerous place after Mexico to be a journalist.
Sasha, sometimes arrivals are, they highlight something that sustained immersion in a culture browns out for you, if you will. So, I was born in the United States, I grew up there, and so I had to re-educate myself against the myths that I grew up with, Whereas you arrived and you could probably see them a lot faster than me because you grew up with a different set of myths. And Kamila was just speaking about the ways in which governments, not just Pakistan, but others, create internal censorship through deployed violence or through censorship. Obviously, ultimate freedom of expression has its own pressures of censorship within the US, that there are certain things within the US that are not talked about as well, even though there is not censorship. And I wondered if you could talk about what you feel is missing to some degree from literary culture, and if, without state actors being censored, where the forces of silencing are coming from.
Well, it's not a censorship, but it's a kind of ideological self-discipline that is very, it was conspicuous to me in the United States. It still is. I remember an editorial in the New York Times on the eve of the Iraq War essentially said, well, this is our last chance to criticize this project because once the war starts, we have to unify. I mean, I'm paraphrasing this. Somehow, democracy was suspended. What if you're fighting the enemy? So, which of course logically leads to the conclusion that we just have to keep having enemies, and then, once there are no enemies, then the full critical faculty of citizenry could kick in. I also remember after the war, I'm really, really pissed still about the war in Iraq and the whole thing. But I remember after the war, after Obama was elected, and there was some brief possibility, there was discussion in the newspapers and on op-ed pages about the possibility of criminal prosecution of Bush and Cheney and various generals and the FBI people who falsified, or CIA people who falsified the evidence and all this. And I remember reading an op-ed piece by the head of the Harvard Law School, whose name I can't remember, of course, but that's, they churn out Supreme Court justices, this Harvard Law School, who said that he didn't think that Cheney and Bush and all those people, Rumsfeld, should be prosecuted for what they did in Iraq because they believed in defending their country. This was the justification. This, as I remember, it was a kind of thing that the Nazis said in Nuremberg. I mean, it's sort of a self-generating logic. If you have the intentions of not erasing a nation, defending your own nation, somehow it should be okay. And so this kind of thing, it's non-ideological. This is not the difference between left and right. In America, there's a widespread notion of American exceptions. It's an exceptional nation that is somehow for that accepted for history. And therefore, standard ethical and moral and legal standards do not apply quite. In other words, the Americans and America itself decides what laws of humanity should be applied to itself. And to me, that is unacceptable as a position in general, but in particular that, that there were no legal consequences to the fiasco in Iraq. A whole part of the world has been ruined for generations. What are you going to do? Let's try something else now. Let's try Trump. That looks like a good idea. And so I was at least, how would I put it, sensitized to this kind of nationalist propaganda because I saw it coming up here and then I saw from afar, but still, what was happening here in Bosnia and the Balkans and all this. And many of those moves that many Americans, even the good ones, left as Democrats, the good ones, the same kind of self-justifying thought processes that are in place. But in terms of literature, I think that those processes, those kind of delusions are interesting, that it's not just a political necessity to attack nationalist discourse, but it's also an interesting aesthetic project to undo American exceptionalism, to undo all these narratives, to undo all these myths, to undo the self-evident value of being American, to undo, everyone talks to me all the time since I started publishing about living or not American dream. And American dream has become this self-axiomatic category. No one really questions what is it, how, why, where is it, what is it? So to me it's necessary to address those things as it would have been necessary had I stayed here. But here it's a different set of myths, and we know what the national myths here are and how they run into each other. while replicating it, another structure.
Kamila, do you feel as a writer that it's important, given what you just said, is to highlight the moments where your characters, or as you do in this short piece that you've written for Freeman, about going to this part of Pakistan with friends, and where you dramatize not just the internal perception of a mediated arrival or existence, but dramatize the ways in which that is applied differently to characters within the book?
Well, it's dramatically interesting, for one thing, but I suppose I've always had an interest because a whole range of things. But I don't know how to think of a story differently. I mean, it's when people say, why is there so much politics in your books? Yes, but how, if I'm thinking, I'm writing a book, it's set in Karachi in 1995. Okay, well in 1995 there were certain things you couldn't do because there was a particular state of violence then, so your characters wouldn't, for instance, be driving to the beach because no one would do that. I mean, it's the daily stuff of life, the decision of where you're going, how you're getting there, is mediated by what is going on in these historical political events, and that's just reality as I know it. But you move to America, you move to England, and people talk as though you can choose whether to put history and politics into people's lives, whether that's the odd choice. Whereas to me, pretending it isn't. I mean, I was once in a panel with an English writer, and she says, I always feel that for my stories to work, I at some point will stop and say, supposing this were happening in a completely different place, in a different time, would it still work? Because, as human beings, we respond the same to events wherever we are, so the story shouldn't be contingent on location and time. And I said, it's the strangest thing I've ever heard. What does that mean? It's not my experience of life.
Sasha, given the current discourse about migration and immigration and the confusion between the two, and refugees, there's sort of three. Refugees and immigrants both migrate, but one of them has choice and one of them does not, in general. And your piece in the issues tells the story of your family's arrival in the U.S., but it also feels like it's coming up with a new definition. Like you're trying to, just as Kamila is trying to recast sort of events within the most complex eye, rather than the perceived normal apolitical narrative. It feels like what you're trying to do is come up with a new definition of what migration is, because you witnessed your parents and you lived it yourself doing it, and it is far different from the one that's dominant.
Well, speaking of myths, there's the great, it's part of the American dream myth that's, maybe there was some justification for it 100 years ago where immigrants would come to the United States and they would go through the Ellis Island processing facility, and then they would land and they would have a hard time. Then they would start working, and then they would do well, and the children would be born there, they would speak English, and there's this whole betterment process. In the meantime, they would send letters to the old country, and they, first once a week, and once a month, and once a year, they would lost touch. And once they retired, they would go back to their village in Sicily or whatever, and then see that everyone they used to know is dead. And so, and by which time the children would be fully American, and this would all be a background story to their American identity. And in all this, what would disappear, for one, I looked into it a little, and so a large number of people who came to the United States 100 years ago went back. They never wanted to become Americans. They just want to make money and come back. One of my best friends' grandfather from Sarajevo, his grandmother was a hotel detective in Chicago, and then he made money being a detective in Chicago. Who knows what it's involved? And then he came back and bought a piece of land in Elija, down the road from here. And his family has lived here ever since. Now he lives in London, but for different reasons. And at the time when we, the Bosnians, were being spread around the world, the whole situation has changed in so many ways. And with the advent of digital technologies, the notion of the ways in which people relate to the new land and the old land have entirely changed, so that it's possible for me, for instance, to be writing in English in the United States and be writing in Bosnia and publish in Sarajevo simultaneously, and then I can come here and curate a festival and so on. And I'm relatively privileged and young, but even for older people, right, they can Skype with family. Grandmothers in Bosnia get their granddaughters shipped from the United States for the summer, and the granddaughters then can speak English and Bosnian to their grandmothers, and they go back and then they study international politics and are bilingual and so on. So the whole concept of immigration has changed so fundamentally, and people like Trump and all those Republican leaders, they have no idea, in fact, what is going on. And I'm just talking about Bosnians. With a Spanish-speaking population, the process is even more vast and complicated, and bicultural operations and bilingual lives are so common that such things are mysteries only to complete idiots like Trump. You know, they live in a small bubble like that. For my parents, however, my parents are different generations, so when they landed in Canada, it was a traumatic thing. They had left because of the war, and they landed there not knowing the language. What they did then, they reshaped the space around them. Whereas to someone like me or younger people, in some ways, I don't care what my surrounding in Chicago looks like, because I live in this virtual space where both Bosnia and Chicago, or Sarajevo and Chicago, Bosnia and the United States, exist simultaneously. But for them, they had to carve out a sovereign space that is governed only by the principles that they have carried over from the old land and in their hand. And so the peace deals with that. The migration it's never been, and now it's less than ever, just lopping off the first half of your life and leaving it behind, and then starting from nothing to become American, you know, once you cross the ocean. The overlapping of the two identities, two lives, two territories, two modes of living, it was always, it is my belief, present. And now it's possible to sustain it logistically, because I can listen to live, and I do live radio from Sarajevo every day of my life in Chicago. And I can read the news and talk to my friends here and work with them over Skype, as I did with Aleksandar. We wrote a script by way of Skype.
Kamila, we've previously worked together. I edited a magazine called Granta, which is based in Britain. And Kamila, a jury selected Kamila as one of their best young British novelists months before she got her British passport. But we wanted to be ahead of that curve. And we were, and one of the interesting things about being there is living in England for 5 years was just how differently Britain, England, mostly England, but Britain talked about immigration versus America, you know, and they had their own, they had similar biases. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about Brexit, because so far you're the only friend of mine who predicted that the Leave people would win. And I wonder if you could talk about that in terms of that Sasha was just describing this. You know, what is the dominant myth of immigration into Britain, and what is it actually like for people that are migrating in from other parts of the EU?
Well, the dominant myth is they're taking our jobs, they're here for the welfare state, and things like that, which, you know, study after study will show no, you know, people don't come here to live off the welfare state. Migrants come in and they look for jobs. It's the first thing they do. They look for jobs, they want to find work. That things like the NHS are mostly staffed by migrants, you know. But, the word that kept going around in Brexit was post-truth. It really was an astonishing, and Trump is another post-truth moment, but the Leave campaign kept coming up with these statements that were patently untrue. It wasn't a matter of perspective. They would say things like, and one of the most, frequently used slogans was, if we leave the EU, we'll have £350 million a week to give to the National Health Services. It was on the sides of trucks, it was everywhere. And the day after the election, you had on Newsnight, which is the current news show, you had Evan Davies, who was the sort of interviewer, talking to a man who had been a huge part of the Leave campaign and had campaigned strenuously, and he brought up this figure. And oh no, it wasn't even that. It was that and freedom of movement. We can't have these migrants coming in, right? If we leave Brexit, there'll be no freedom of movement, and then all these terrible European migrants will stop coming in. And so Evan Davies says to this guy, so it'll stop freedom of movement. And the man basically says, well, actually, probably not. And he said, this is the whole Evan Davies actually puts his head in his hands. The whole campaign, this is what you've been saying. And 350 million for the NHS, the whole campaign has been saying that. And by the next day, they were saying they had to manage expectations. So it was not, actually, that probably won't happen. And actually, what is particularly terrifying to me about it is there are a lot of people who voted Leave, believing these two things, believing one, that their welfare state would do better, that these migrants would stop coming in and taking their jobs and taking stuff from the welfare state. And they went to the referendum and they voted for this to happen. And now they're being told, actually, the very thing you voted for, even though you voted for it and won, those things aren't going to happen. So what happens then with the anger of those people? We're not at the end of this story by any means. How are you going to then break it? Because the people who didn't want to leave are angry enough that this has happened, but now those who wanted to leave are going to be made even angrier when discovering that Leave looks nothing like they thought Leave would look like. Leave may end up looking more like Remain.
Well, the post-truth thing started in Bush's America. With Karl Rove, the advisor of George Bush, the famous ideologue and propagandist who orchestrated Bush's campaigns, public campaigns. He mocked famously, it was quoted mocking journalists as being a reality-based community. And the American journalists are far from being commendable for the things they did or didn't do rather during the Bush years. But Rove talked about this reality-based community as a bunch of naives, people just stuck in reality like fools, whereas they are operating in the realm of post-truth realm. Trump and his blatant, constant lying, and none of his supporters caring about it, is a direct consequence of that. It's kind of Wittgenstein's nightmare, the whole thing.
And so, of course, in Britain, the version of that was Tony Blair, right? So, I think the Iraq War is sort of significant for so many reasons, and obviously the most significant reason has to do with Iraq. But there are other things, within other countries. So in Britain, I think the strength of the opposition to that war, and the fact that it was ignored, and the fact that, we kept being told weapons of mass destruction, things that weren't there, and then it later turned out everyone knew weren't there. And Britain, as opposed to America, has had an inquiry. So you had the Chilcot report just out, which was damning and saying, basically, Blair sends Bush a letter and says, I'm with you no matter what.
Whatever.
I'm with you whatever. Forget fact, forget truth, forget anything, forget Parliament, forget the people. Right? And I think that was a really crucial moment in the beginning of a total lack of faith in politicians or mainstream politicians, which is what then allows something like the rise of UKIP, which is your far-right, anti-migrant, placing itself as being completely outside Westminster politics. You see the rise of that. Trump is another version of it. And you're just creating, the more the politicians lie and the more post-truth they are, the more you're creating spaces for people to look elsewhere for their leaders.
Yeah, no, I agree with both of you on this, and I think we're often in the West we are having a discussion about being in a false dialectic East-West with anti-Enlightenment forces, and it is true that that Daesh or ISIS or ISIL, whatever you want to call them, do want to return life to a rather prehistoric notion of humanhood. But similarly, in the West, in the sort of neoliberal sections of the West, which are actually sort of right-leaning, the way that government is constructed and the way it operates and the way it advertises and speaks about what it's doing to its public is anti-enlightenment, because it is a deliberate misuse often of factualness. And I suspect you all have things to do this afternoon, so I want to round out with one kind of final question, which is, this is a literary anthology. It's not it's political because everything is political, but there are works of poetry and Carson. There's a wonderful poem by Hassan Zaktan, a Palestinian poet, sort of about how he could never technically arrive where he's from, because where he's from technically does not exist, because it's not a state, it's an occupied territory. Louise Erdrich, a Native American novelist, describes going home to a place where birth and death are kind of celebrated equally, which is her home reservation. The novelist Haruki Murakami has a short story about an actor who, every time he finishes a role and returns to the person he is, or it's a different person than he left prior to the role. And he's looking at that in the context of being a widower. And I wonder, both of you are novelists, but both of you have written nonfiction here. And I wonder if you find yourselves, Sasha, I'll ask you first, because you say there's an often overrated dividing line between nonfiction and fiction, that it's all literature. And yet, when you write about Arrival, there are certain facts you want to get straight. And so do you feel like there are certain arrivals you must write about in a factual way versus a fictional way?
Well, I mean, I don't mean to correct you, but I don't think of myself as a novelist, because I'm a writer, and I write many things, and I do not really favor one way or another. They all have inherent tendencies and possibilities that I like to exploit. What we call in English nonfiction, addresses, communicates with the reader in a particular, in a different way that is dependent on the expectations the reader has, right? That I'm not making this stuff up. So the first layer of reading would be addressing the factuality of what happened rather than the symbolic value of what happened. But with all that, and people here that understand this, when I was translating my book of nonfiction, not me, but Irene Zlov, we were translating this to publish it here, the book of my life, and in the acknowledgement there's a reference to fiction and nonfiction. Irena and I, we didn't know how to exactly translate it, because there is no word for nonfiction, or fiction for that matter, in Bosnian, that is simply not imported directly. There's no native concept. It is not simply imported from English. And so we cut out the acknowledgement so to deal with that, because it was not a big part of the thing. But because of that, I was thinking about it a lot. And to me, the overarching category is storytelling, at least in prose. Obviously, poetry functions differently. There are certain stories that are better told in this mode than in that mode. There are certain stories that are complete without addition and reconfiguration that comes with, fictionalizing it. And some stories, they stand without any of that. In the Freeman book #2, which hadn't arrived just in time to show it to you, I wrote a piece, a non-fiction piece about my father's uncle, who spent 25 years in Stalinist concentration camps. Was born in Bosnia, went to Soviet Union in 26, spent 31 years there until after Stalin's death, and then spent 20 of those years in concentration camps in Siberia, and was brought back to Yugoslavia in 1957. The story goes by Tito intervened and asked Khrushchev to send him back, the surviving Yugoslav communist. Anyway, I wrote this as non-fiction. I wrote a fictional story based on this uncle, which is in my first book, The Question of Bruno. Then I wrote this non-fictional piece, which is in some ways different, and I had considered at some point even try to rewrite it as fiction, and it didn't work. I dropped after 3 or 4 pages. I started adding things, and whether adjectives or scenes and all this, it just didn't need it. It was too much icing on the cake, so to speak. And so then I returned to nonfiction because it did not need being fictionalized anymore than I had done in the first time I used this character. So to me, what we call fiction, non-fiction in English, it's on a continuum of storytelling. There are all kinds of storytelling modes. Some of them require to be written down, but many of them are, oral.
Kamila, your piece, you described going to this town and being stalked by several men who project the ability to interrupt your movement. And I won't give up more than that. But did you feel it was important to write this in a mode? Sasha talked about expectations, that the reader would expect to believe that this happened. As in you could have written this as a fable, as a short story, as a, or were you really just trying to beat my deadline?
I was trying to meet you. No, it was one of those. It's an event that happened, and as soon as it finished happening, or by the next morning, I was telling it to people around me as a story. And I knew instantly why I was doing it. It was a way of controlling it, because there'd been a part that was terrifying, and I needed to control it and make bits of it funny and all of that. So actually, story was the form it took, not fiction, but story. And so that sort of seemed to be the way it had to arrive on the page, as it were. I haven't done a lot of writing like that. I've done quite a few essays or columns or things like that, which are not in the story mode. So there's a much stronger dividing line between most of my non-fiction, which I don't do with anything like the same seriousness as Sasha does. But it's sort of, I'll do essays. This was a lot of fun to do. I don't know that I could do it for a sustained period, because there is something, unlike Sasha, I do describe myself as a novelist, because there's something in that form that I know and I love and that my brain goes to. And I suppose the best way I can say it is, when I'm writing fiction and it's going well, and often it doesn't, but when I'm writing fiction and it's going well, that really for me is the feeling of arriving home. In a way that another form isn't. There's not the same sense for me of being transported, I suppose.
I think that's a great place to end, because the philosophy I hope that comes across through this literary journal is I really believe in the power of storytelling, and that whether it's poetry, whether it's nonfiction, whether it's fiction, that you can. It's not about empathy, which I know is often oversold, but it's rather about the interaction between the writer's imagination and story, and experience and the reader's imagination, and making those two things connect on the page. And it's a huge privilege to have Sasha and Kamila in the first issue, because you can see just a tiny bit, I think, in how they tell stories on stage. We'll give you just a fraction of how brilliant they are on the page, where it matters, where it can be transported, where it can arrive with you wherever you go home, whether it's Cairo or Montreal or Sarajevo or wherever. So I encourage you to check it out at the library, pick it up here and read it, buy it, do whatever. Please don't burn it. And join me and thank you.
Unless you're very cold, which is
Yeah.
fine.
There's an announcement.
Of course, somebody else has to make an announcement. The next event, of course, is highly anticipated at Hemon Kuran's presentation here at 5, and then at 7 you might be interested in Sasha Hemon's columns book. Probably not many people are going to come anyway. Because that's what usually happens when he does book launches here. And of course at 9, Rabi Al-Madin's launch, which we also waited for a very long time. Tomorrow, however, Mario Levy's event is cancelled because he couldn't leave Turkey. So the highlight of the day will be, of course, our great and very welcome guest, Kamila Shamsie, with John Freeman again as a presenter. The last one. Thank you.
Oh, I just spreading them appropriately.